Victoria Langford did not tolerate mistakes. Not small ones, not large ones, and certainly not the kind that made her look disorganized in front of anyone who mattered. So when her personal driver of 3 years showed up 19 minutes late to collect her from the airport, 19 minutes during which she stood at the curb with her luggage, her phone pressed to her ear, and the full weight of a collapsing quarterly timeline pressing down on her chest, she made the decision before he even pulled to the stop. By the time Marcus had stepped out of the car and begun his apology, her assistant had already received the termination notice by text. That was how Victoria operated. Precise. Final. Without sentiment. She was 34 years old and ran Nexus Core Technologies, a mid-sized firm that had grown from 40 employees to nearly 400 in the span of 6 years under her leadership. The company built supply chain software for manufacturing clients across North America and parts of Europe, and it had done well enough that its most recent fiscal year had produced revenue that made investors comfortable and a growth trajectory that made them optimistic. But Victoria was not interested in comfort or optimism. She was interested in the step that would take Nexus Core from a respected mid-tier player to something that occupied a different kind of space entirely. And that step had a name and a price tag. The name was Meridian Industrial Group, a German-American conglomerate that managed production facilities across 11 countries. The price tag was $19 million, which was the value of the partnership contract Victoria had been pursuing for 8 months. 8 months of relationship building, proposal iterations, pricing model adjustments, conference appearances timed specifically to put her team in proximity to Meridian's decision-makers, and a level of focused attention that had consumed more of her personal bandwidth than she would have admitted to anyone, including herself. If the deal closed, Nexus Core would have the capital, the credibility, and the infrastructure access to expand into a market that had previously been entirely out of reach. If it fell through, Victoria would spend the next 12 months explaining to her board why the most expensive business development campaign in company history had produced nothing. The pressure was the kind that didn't let you sleep properly. The kind that followed you into the car, into the elevator, into the bathroom in the morning. She had been managing it with the same discipline she applied to everything else: structured days, precise agendas, no wasted motion. But the loss of her driver at this specific moment in the calendar was an irritant she did not need. She called her head of operations while walking back into the terminal. "Find me someone by tomorrow morning," she said. "Reliable. Discreet. Professional." Then she ended the call and moved on. The person HR found was named Ethan Carter. His file was brief. 41 years old. Clean driving record. Currently operating as an independent contractor through a private car service. Previous employment listed one line that read, "Business management, self-employed," followed by a gap of several years, and then the car service. There was a note that he had passed all background checks and carried his own liability insurance. His rating through the service was 4.9 out of 5, across hundreds of trips. Victoria's assistant printed the file, placed it on her desk, and Victoria glanced at it for approximately 15 seconds before sliding it to the side. "Fine," she said. "Have him here at 6:45 tomorrow." He was there at 6:30. She noticed that. She also noticed that the interior of the car was immaculate, that there was a small bottle of still water placed in the cup holder closest to her door, not sparkling, which she could not stand, and that he had already mapped 2 route alternatives in case of construction delays near the financial district. He greeted her with a short, professional nod, did not attempt small talk, and pulled into traffic with the quiet efficiency of someone who had learned that the most useful thing a driver could be was invisible. Victoria settled into her seat, opened her laptop, and told herself she had been right to fire Marcus. This was how it was supposed to work. She gave Ethan Carter almost no thought for the rest of that first week. He was a function, not a person, in the architecture of her daily schedule. He arrived when he was supposed to arrive. He navigated without asking questions. And he maintained a silence that she had come to think of as the most professional quality a person in his position could possess. On the occasions when she took calls in the back seat, and she took many, he gave no indication that he was listening. He kept his eyes on the road. He adjusted the temperature slightly When the afternoon sun hit the rear windshield, he had her at the lobby of Nexus Corps' offices within 2 minutes of the time she had estimated each morning. He was, she concluded, exactly what the job required. Nothing more. It was during the second week that she first noticed something she could not immediately categorize. She was on a call with her VP of Business Development, running through the timeline for the Meridian presentation. When she said something about the proposal's pricing model specifically, that the structure was aggressive but defensible given projected client ROI over 3 years. She ended the call. The car was quiet. Then Ethan said, in the mild and unhurried way that she was beginning to recognize as simply how he spoke, 3 years might be the wrong window. She looked up from her screen. He kept his eyes on the road. If Meridian is evaluating on a 5-year cycle, which most capital-intensive manufacturers do, the ROI math looks different. It might read as underselling. He paused. Just something I heard. She stared at the back of his head for a moment. Then she looked back at her screen and said nothing. But she pulled up the Meridian Group's last published annual report that night and spent 40 minutes reading through their capital allocation strategy. He was right. She adjusted the model the following morning. She told herself it was a coincidence. One observation from someone who had probably absorbed enough business conversation in the back of that car to pick up the vocabulary. It meant nothing, but the observations did not stop. A week later, during a particularly difficult morning, when she was managing a call with her CFO about the cost of extending their current credit line to fund the Meridian pitch, she mentioned offhand frustrated, speaking too freely because she was tired and had not slept well, that she didn't understand why the Meridian team kept pushing back the final meeting date. 3 delays in 4 weeks. They had the proposal. They had the pricing. What were they waiting for? The CFO didn't have an answer. She ended the call. The car moved through traffic. And Ethan said, without turning his head, if a partner keeps delaying a signature, they're usually waiting to see if someone else comes in with a better offer. The delay itself is the negotiation. She did not respond, but she felt something cold settle at the base of her spine, because that was exactly what it was. She knew it the moment he said it. She had known it, somewhere below the surface, but had not wanted to acknowledge it because the implication was uncomfortable. Meridian was shopping the contract. She went back to her office that afternoon and quietly instructed her intelligence director, a man she had hired away from a strategy consulting firm to run a competitive scan. 24 hours later, he came back with a name, Corova Systems, a San Francisco-based competitor that had been meeting with Meridian's procurement division for the past 6 weeks. They had a leaner pricing model and a newer platform built on an architecture that was genuinely faster at the data ingestion layer, though it had not yet been tested at Meridian's scale. They were a real threat. Victoria called an emergency session with her executive team that evening. She did not mention where the concern had originated. She spent the next 3 days rebuilding the proposal from the structural layer up, reframing the value, not as cost savings but as operational certainty, the thing that a company like Meridian, running facilities across 11 countries, actually needed more than it needed to save a few $100,000 a year. Operational certainty was the thing that let you sleep. Operational certainty was the thing that let you make promises to your customers in 14 countries and then keep them. Corova could offer speed on paper. Nexus Corps could offer something that could not be replicated by a leaner pricing model. A track record of doing exactly what it said it would do. Documented across 7 years of client relationships in industries with complexity that matched Meridian's own. It was better work. Sharper. Truer. And it had started because a driver had said 9 words on the way to the office. She started paying attention. Not openly, she would not have framed it that way to herself or to anyone else, but she began to listen when he spoke, which was not often. And she found herself noticing the quality of the silence he kept. It was not the silence of someone who had nothing to say. It was the silence of someone who had learned to choose when to say it. She had encountered that quality in exactly 3 people in her professional life, and all 3 of them had been very good at what they did. One was her mentor from the early years, A woman who had built and sold 2 companies before age 50, and who could sit through a negotiation for 2 hours without saying a word, and then ask the single question that reorganized the entire conversation. One was the best engineer she had ever hired, a man who communicated in complete, minimal sentences, and had never in 4 years at Nexus Core made a statement he could not back with evidence. The third was her board chair, a man who had the specific gravity of someone who had seen enough cycles of business to be genuinely unimpressed by almost anything, and who spoke therefore with the authority of the unimpressed. She didn't know what to do with the fact that the fourth was driving her to meetings every morning. One Tuesday, she left her assistant's printed briefing sheets on the seat when she stepped out, and when she returned to the car an hour later, they were sitting precisely where she had left them. She was almost certain they had been moved and returned. She could not explain why she was almost certain of this. She just was. That evening, she asked her assistant to run a background search on Ethan Carter. Basic parameters: employment history, any corporate filings, any public records that might fill in the gap between business management and car service. Her assistant came back the next morning and said he had not found much. The car service records, a residential address in a suburb 40 minutes from downtown, and one small detail that had seemed unremarkable, but that she had included anyway. Ethan Carter had a daughter. She was 9 years old. He had full custody. He picked her up from school every day at 3:15, which was why he was always unavailable after 2:30, unless given advance notice. Victoria looked at that detail and filed it without response. She was not interested in his personal life. She was interested in the gap in his professional record. It closed, partially, 3 days later. She was preparing for a call when Ethan pulled to the side to let a delivery truck clear the intersection. And as the car idled, she glanced forward and realized he was reading something on his phone, not absent-mindedly scrolling, but reading with the focused stillness of someone absorbing complex material. She leaned forward slightly and saw the screen. It was a financial prospectus, dense text, tables, margin annotations. She recognized the format. She had read hundreds of them herself. She looked away before he could notice her looking. She said nothing, but something inside her had shifted, quietly and without announcement. The way the whole character of a room shifts when someone walks in and you don't yet know who they are. Her assistant came through 2 days later with something more. A second search. Deeper this time. Using a network of public filing databases, Ethan Carter had been listed as a registered agent and co-founder of a company called ClearPath Logistics Solutions, incorporated 14 years ago in the state of Delaware. ClearPath had grown from a regional freight coordination firm into a nationally recognized logistics technology company with a peak valuation. This number was the one that made her assistant sit down before she said it, of approximately $240 million. The company had been acquired by a private equity group 9 years ago. The terms of the acquisition had not been fully disclosed, but secondary sources estimated Ethan Carter's personal stake had been worth somewhere between $30 and $50 million at the time of sale. After the acquisition, his name disappeared from every public filing, every conference list, every industry directory, as though he had simply stopped existing in the professional world. There was a brief mention in a trade publication from about 8 years ago, a sidebar item. Barely 2 sentences noting that Ethan Carter, former ClearPath co-founder and CEO, had declined to comment on rumors that he was launching a new venture. That was the last professional mention she could find. After that, nothing. A man who had moved through the industry with the specific gravity of someone genuinely accomplished had simply walked off stage and pulled the curtain behind him. Victoria sat with that information for a long time. She did not call him in. She did not confront him with it. She did not rearrange her thinking loudly or dramatically. She simply sat with it, turning it over, the way you turn over something you found on the beach that you can't immediately identify. A man who had built and sold a $200 million company was now driving her to work every morning, reading financial prospectuses while he waited for her outside office buildings, picking up his daughter at 3:15, and occasionally, almost as an afterthought, saying things that turned out to be exactly right. She thought about the divorce her assistant had found, a court record, a custody filing from 7 years ago, the case number and the date. Nothing else disclosed. She thought about what it costs, in every possible denomination, to lose something you built. She knew what ClearPath had been. Now that she had looked at the trade publications from the years when it was growing a company, people in logistics talked about the way people in any industry talk about the firms that are doing something differently, with the mixture of respect and competitive unease that is the truest form of professional acknowledgement. He had built that, and then something had happened, and he had put his daughter in the back of whatever car he had left and driven away from it, and ended up in a car service in the city where she worked, and had never mentioned any of it to anyone. She thought about the line in his profile: business management, self-employed, the most understated resume entry she had ever read. She wanted to ask him about it. She didn't. Instead, she watched. She noted that when her phone rang and the conversation turned tense, his hands on the wheel stayed perfectly still. She noted that when she was working through a strategic problem out loud, something she sometimes did when she forgot he was there, or when she was tired enough to stop performing, he would occasionally, without fanfare, offer a one-sentence observation that cut directly to the thing she had been circling. She noted that he never seemed to want anything from her. No recognition, no acknowledgement, no elevation. He just drove the car, and waited, and sometimes said the true thing, and then went home to his daughter. She found that more unsettling than she would have found almost anything else. The day of the final Meridian meeting arrived on a Thursday in October, with a sky the color of slate and a cold that had come in overnight. Victoria had been awake since 4. She had reviewed the presentation materials 3 times. She had spoken with her legal team, her CFO, her VP of Business Development, and her head of client strategy. She had prepared for every objection Meridian's leadership might raise, every competing argument Korova Systems might have seeded, every strategic reservation the Meridian board might be harboring about committing to a long-term technology partnership with a company that, for all its growth, was still smaller than they were. She had mapped the conversation the way she mapped everything. Comprehensively, in advance, with contingencies. She was as ready as she had ever been for anything. Ethan drove her to the Meridian Group's North American headquarters without speaking. She did not speak either. She watched the city move past the windows and thought about the next 3 hours and what they would mean either way. When the car stopped at the entrance, she gathered her materials and paused before opening the door. For a reason she could not have fully explained, she looked at Ethan in the rearview mirror. He was watching traffic. She got out without a word. The meeting room on the 14th floor was large enough to feel formal without being intimidating, a deliberate design choice. She recognized. The Meridian team was already seated when Victoria arrived with her executive team, 6 people on their side of the table, led by Harold Weston, Meridian's chairman, and the man who had final say on any partnership of this scale. He was in his mid-60s, silver-haired, and possessed of the particular brand of stillness that belongs to men who have spent decades in rooms exactly like this one and have learned to use the silence itself as a form of pressure. He stood to greet her, shook her hand with the correct duration, and said it was good to finally be in the room. His expression was professionally pleasant. His eyes were measuring. Victoria presented. She had been told she was a compelling presenter, and she believed this, because it was objectively true. She had spent years developing the skill, and she knew exactly where in the room to direct her attention, exactly how to modulate her pace, exactly how to hold the emotional temperature of a difficult conversation. She moved through the proposal with fluency and confidence, addressed the ROI modeling on a 5-year cycle, because she had adjusted it the way Ethan had suggested, laid out the risk mitigation framework, and opened the floor for questions. The questions came. She answered them. Her team answered the ones that required technical depth. And yet something in the room was wrong. She could feel it the way you feel a change in air pressure before a storm. Harold Weston was listening. He was asking appropriate questions. He was nodding at appropriate moments. And he was not there. Some essential part of his attention was withheld, and she could not find the thread that would bring it back. She watched her VP of Business Development make an argument about platform scalability that was very good and correct and seemed to move nothing. She watched her CFO present the investment return scenarios with precision and clarity, and watched Weston's expression remain exactly as it was, pleasant and unmoved, and somewhere else entirely. She tried a different angle. She spoke about the specific facilities Meridian operated in the Ohio Valley, where Nexus Core had comparable client deployments, and she made the case in operational terms rather than financial ones, speaking about line efficiency and order fulfillment accuracy and the downstream effect on customer relationship management. This was her strongest material. She knew it was her strongest material. She watched it make no visible impression on the man who needed to be impressed. His 2 lieutenants were engaged. His procurement lead was taking notes. Weston himself sat at the center of the table and listened with the polite, complete attention of someone who had already decided something and was simply waiting for the conversation to arrive at the moment when he could say so. She had 40 minutes before the scheduled end of the meeting. She was running out of ground. Then Harold Weston looked toward the window. The conference room faced the building's main entrance, and through the glass, 12 floors down, the car was parked at the curb. Ethan was outside it, leaning against the hood in the cold, reading something on his phone with the same focused stillness she had seen before. She watched Weston's gaze land on him. She watched something happen in Weston's face that she had not been able to produce in 90 minutes of professional presentation. His expression changed. Not dramatically. A man like Weston did not do things dramatically. But his posture shifted, and something came into his eyes that had not been there, and he turned back to the table and said, quietly and with complete certainty, "Who is that man outside?" The room went still. Victoria looked at her team. She looked at Weston. "That's my driver," she said. And even as she said it, she heard how it sounded not wrong exactly, but insufficient, like answering a question about a painting by describing the frame. Weston was already standing. "I need to speak with him," he said, and there was no interrogative inflection in it. No request structure. It was the tone of a man stating what was going to happen next. She went downstairs herself. She crossed the lobby and pushed through the glass door into the cold. Ethan looked up from his phone and registered her expression, which she suspected communicated more than she intended, and said nothing. "Harold Weston wants to speak with you," she said. "The chairman of Meridian." Ethan's expression did not change in the way she expected. He simply looked at her for a moment, then nodded slowly, as though this were a piece of information he was quietly integrating, and said, "All right." He put his phone in his jacket pocket. He followed her inside. What happened in the elevator was something she would think about for a long time afterward. She was watching him the way she had not permitted herself to watch him before directly, with full attention, and what she saw was a man who was not preparing himself for anything, not rehearsing a persona, not building toward a performance. He was just standing in an elevator, going up 14 floors to a meeting he had not known about 2 minutes ago, and he looked exactly as calm as he always looked. She thought about how much work she put into that kind of composure, how much she rehearsed it, how many years it had taken her to build the architecture of it, and she thought about what it meant that he carried it without any visible architecture at all. When they walked back into the conference room, Harold Weston crossed toward them before the door had fully closed. He extended his hand to Ethan, and the handshake lasted longer than handshakes in business meetings were supposed to last, and there was something in it that preceded language, the recognition between two people who have shared a specific kind of experience that most people never have. "Ethan Carter," Weston said. And the way he said the name was not a greeting, it was a confirmation, as though he had suspected something and was now certain. "I thought that was you. It's been a long time." Ethan smiled. And it was the first time Victoria had seen him smile fully. And it changed his face in a way she could not have predicted. "About 8 years," Ethan said. "You look well, Harold." The room was completely silent. Every member of Victoria's executive team was staring, and she could read all of them, because she had worked with them long enough to know their faces, and what she read was a version of the same thing. She was feeling the vertiginous sensation of a floor that had appeared solid turning out to be something else entirely. Weston turned back to the room. "Ethan and I met a long time ago," he said, in the tone of a man who is choosing how much to tell. "His firm was brought in to restructure a logistics operation in our European division. We were 3 weeks from losing a partnership worth more than we want to think about." He paused. "He found the problem in 48 hours. Solved it in 2 weeks. There are people in this organization who still talk about it. He looked at Ethan with the specific regard that people reserve for those who have helped them in moments that mattered. I didn't know where you went, he said. I heard you sold ClearPath. I did, Ethan said. I needed to step back for a while. Weston nodded in the way of someone who understood exactly what step back meant when said by someone like Ethan, and did not press it. What happened next had a quality that Victoria would later struggle to describe accurately to anyone who had not been in the room. Weston sat back down. He looked at Ethan and said, I want your read on something. Not on the proposal, not on the pricing or the platform or the partnership terms, all of which had been presented with exhaustive care over the previous 90 minutes. On something. And Ethan, who had walked into this room 10 minutes ago without knowing he would be in it, said, All right, tell me what's holding you back. Weston looked at him for a moment. And then he told him, not in the language of contract terms or procurement evaluation, in the direct language of two people who have been in enough rooms to know when the room language is hiding the real one. What he said was this: Meridian had been burned before. They had entered a technology partnership 4 years ago that had promised transformational outcomes and delivered operational disruption instead. They had spent 18 months and more money than he would specify undoing what that partnership had done to 3 of their facilities. The scar was institutional. The hesitation was not about Nexus Core specifically, it was about the category of promise. Victoria heard this and felt 2 things simultaneously. The recognition that this was the thing she had not known, and therefore could not have addressed, and the quieter, more uncomfortable recognition that Ethan had been circling it for weeks. The comment about the proposal being underselling. The observation about the delay being a negotiation. The sense she'd had, driving through the city on cold mornings, that he was reading a map she didn't have access to. He had been reading it. He had been reading it because he had been in exactly this situation before, from both sides, and he understood the language of institutional scar tissue in the way that only someone who had caused some and healed some could understand it. Ethan did not offer reassurances. He did not tell Weston that Nexus Core was different, that the technology was better, that Victoria's team was not like the team that had burned them before, all of which would have been the instinctive things to say, all of which would have landed as exactly what they were, which was sales language wearing the costume of candor. What he did instead was ask Weston to describe the previous failure in operational terms. Where did the friction occur? At the integration stage? At the training stage? In the data migration? Weston answered, and as he answered, something shifted in his posture, the subtle unburdening of a person who has been carrying something that no one has thought to ask about directly. His procurement lead shifted in her seat. One of the lieutenants put down his pen. Ethan asked 2 more questions. Both precise, both aimed not at the symptoms of what had gone wrong, but at the structural decisions that had allowed it to go wrong. Then he said, The failure you're describing was a sequencing problem. The partner went to full deployment before the data architecture was stable. That's a project management failure, not a technology failure. He paused, and in the pause the room was very quiet in the specific way rooms go quiet when a true thing has been said. What Nexus Core's model does differently is stage the rollout against stability benchmarks. You don't advance to the next phase until the previous one is verified. It's slower in the first 6 months. The outcomes after month 12 are significantly better. You trade speed for certainty, and certainty is what you actually need at your scale. He looked at Victoria. Is the phased rollout timeline in the materials you presented? It's in the appendix, she said. Her voice was steady. She was grateful for that. Harold, Ethan said, if you look at pages 31 through 34, the staging framework is there. It directly addresses what you experienced. Weston looked at Victoria. She slid the document across the table to the correct page. He put on his reading glasses and read. The room was quiet for a long time. Weston's 2 lieutenants leaned in to read alongside him. Someone on Victoria's team shifted in their seat. Outside the windows, the city continued its complete indifference to what was happening on the 14th floor. After several minutes, Weston looked up. He took off his glasses. He looked at Ethan, then at Victoria, then back at Ethan, and then he said, "All right. Let's talk about the terms." What followed was 3 hours of detailed negotiation, and Victoria was present for all of it, arguing, adjusting, holding certain positions, and releasing others, doing the work she was actually very good at when the room had the right temperature. She negotiated the implementation timeline down from 18 months to 14, secured a performance guarantee clause that protected Nexus Core from scope creep, and managed to retain the pricing structure her team had built, rather than accepting the modified terms Meridian's procurement lead tried to introduce at the 90-minute mark. She knew when to hold and when to yield, and she read the room the way she had spent years learning to read rooms, with the full attention of someone who understands that negotiation is less about the words being spoken than about the emotional architecture behind them, the hidden geometry of what each person at the table needs to leave with in order to feel that they have not lost. Ethan spoke 4 more times during those 3 hours, each time with the brevity of someone who had learned that a precisely placed sentence does more than a paragraph. Each time, something in the room shifted slightly in a direction that was useful. The 4th time he spoke was at the 2.5-hour mark, when the conversation had bogged down over the governance structure for the quarterly business reviews, a procedural dispute that had the capacity to derail everything if it was allowed to become symbolic, Ethan said, without preamble. The review structure matters less than who's in the room for them. If both organizations commit to having decision-makers present, not project managers, decision-makers, the format is secondary. Weston looked at him. Then he looked at his procurement lead. Then he nodded once, and the dispute dissolved. By the time the papers were brought out, this was not the formal signing, which would require another round of legal review, but the letter of intent, which was the thing that mattered, the thing that meant it was real. Victoria's hand was steady as she signed, and Harold Weston's hand was steady when he signed after her, and they shook hands across the table with the full weight of $19 million and whatever came after it held inside the gesture. When it was over, Weston walked them to the elevator. He and Ethan spoke quietly for a moment, while Victoria's team collected their materials, and she could not hear what they said. She watched Ethan nod, and she watched something pass between the two men, in the way things pass between people who have seen the particular underbelly of high-stakes commerce and have managed to remain decent people on the other side of it. In the elevator going down, her team was restraining what she could see was a considerable impulse to celebrate. She let them have the energy, but kept herself quiet. She was thinking about what had just happened, the whole shape of it, from the moment Weston looked out the window to the moment the papers were signed. She was thinking about a man who had driven her to meetings for 6 weeks, who had said 12 consequential things in 6 weeks, who had charged nothing extra for any of them. In the car, she waited until they had cleared the parking structure and were moving through the city. Then she said, "You could have told me who you were." Ethan was quiet for a moment. "You didn't ask," he said, "and it wasn't relevant." "It was relevant today," she said. "Today it was relevant," he agreed. She looked at the back of his head and thought about all the mornings, all the routes, all the calls he had heard. "Why are you driving a car?" she asked. Not accusatory, just the question. He was quiet again, longer this time, and she had learned enough about his silences to know that this one was not evasion but something closer to the honest selection of which truth to tell. After the divorce, he said, "I had my daughter half the time and then full-time." She needed consistency. A fixed address. A school she could stay in. A father who was home when she needed him to be home. He paused. "The kind of life I was living before the travel, the board meetings, the 60-hour weeks, it wasn't compatible with being the father she needed. So I made a choice." He said this without self-pity, without performance, with the flat simplicity of someone describing the weather. "Driving lets me control my schedule. I can be at her school at 3:15 every day. I can take her to her appointments. I can be there." He said the last 2 words with a weight that was not heavy but was very full. Victoria thought about that for a long time on the drive back. Not about the business implications, not about what she should do with what she now knew about him, not about the deal or the board or the next 12 months. She thought about what it meant to choose something difficult and mean it. She had made many difficult choices in her professional life, and she was proud of them, and she knew they had cost her things, relationships, rest, the ordinary texture of a life that is not organized entirely around outcomes. She had always told herself that the costs were worth it. Sitting in the back of that car, she was less certain than she had been, and she could not entirely explain why. She offered him the position the following week. She had drafted it carefully. Senior Strategic Advisor, a role that would formalize what he had been doing informally, that would give him a seat at the table in executive discussions, that would compensate him at a level appropriate to what he demonstrably was capable of doing. The compensation package she had put together was serious, the kind of number that would have been meaningful to almost anyone, the kind that said the offer was real and not symbolic. She made the offer in the car, on a Tuesday morning, because she had decided that the car was actually the right place for it, the place where they had done all their real talking, such as it was. She told him the title, and she told him the number, and she told him that she meant it entirely, and that the board would support it, and that she thought he was wasting something the world needed. Then she waited. He was quiet for a long distance. Long enough that she began to wonder if he was going to respond at all, or if he would simply let the silence say it. Then he said, "I appreciate that. I genuinely do," and she could hear that he meant it not as a courtesy, but as a true acknowledgement of what the gesture represented. The rarity of being seen clearly by someone who had initially not seen you at all, and the grace in that seeing finally arriving. But I'm going to say no. She had expected this and had told herself she was ready for it. And she discovered she was not quite as ready as she had thought. "Why?" she asked. He considered. "Why? Because I know what I am," he said, without needing a title to confirm it. "And because what I have right now is actually what I want. My daughter is 9. She's going to be 9 for about 11 more months. I'm not going to buy back the parts of this I've missed. I just want to be present for the parts that are still here." He paused. "The work you do matters. What Nexus Core is building matters. I'm glad I could help. I don't need it to be more than that." She did not argue with him. She thought briefly about arguing with him, and then recognized that the impulse was about her needs, not his. And she let it go. "If you ever change your mind," she said. "I won't," he said. And he said it without arrogance, simply as a man stating an accurate fact about himself. "But thank you." It meant something. The weeks that followed had a different texture than the weeks before the Meridian deal. The company celebrated, as companies do when the number is large enough to shift the trajectory of the organization. Her board was pleased in the particular way boards are pleased when they expected a setback, and received a windfall instead. There were press inquiries, internal announcements, a strategy session about how to leverage the Meridian partnership as a demonstration case for future clients in the same tier. Her VP of Business Development wanted to build a full case study anonymized at first, perhaps public later, with Meridian's consent. Her CFO was already modeling what the capital infusion made possible in terms of platform development and market expansion. Her legal team was drafting the formal partnership agreement in careful alignment with the letter of intent. The company's momentum, which had been stalling slightly under the weight of the extended deal timeline, resumed with the particular energy of an organization that has been given a reason to believe in what it's doing again. Victoria managed all of it with her usual precision, present in every conversation, moving every piece forward with the efficiency that had always defined how she worked. But something had changed in her, quietly and without announcement, the way the most significant changes tend to happen, not with a dramatic moment of realization, but with a gradual reorientation, a shift in the angle from which she was seeing things. She caught herself, in meetings, pausing longer before the moment when she would typically have drawn her conclusion, looking at the person across the table for a second or two more than her usual rhythm required, wondering what she might be not seeing. She continued using Ethan as her driver. She was honest enough with herself to acknowledge that this was not entirely logistical. She had other options. Now the company's car service could provide 3 certified drivers on short notice. She kept using Ethan because of something she did not have clean language for, Not exactly because of who he was in some abstract sense, but because of what it felt like to be in the car with someone who had chosen, with full information and full capability, to be exactly where he was. There was something about that she needed to be near. She wasn't sure what to do with that need, but she stopped pretending it wasn't there. On a Friday morning in November, she was in the car when he picked up a call, the first time she had heard him take a personal call during a trip, and she heard a child's voice through the phone, high and bright and unself-conscious, in the way of children who have no reason to be anything but entirely themselves. The voice was asking about dinner, about whether they could get pizza, about whether she could choose the toppings this time because last time he had put mushrooms on and she did not like mushrooms and she had told him that. She heard him say, "Yes, sweetheart, and I'll be there at 3:15, and what do you want on the pizza?" And she watched his face in the mirror while he said these things and saw what was there. It was uncomplicated. She had spent years trying to produce, in rooms full of important people, the quality of presence that was simply and naturally on his face when he was talking to his daughter about pizza toppings. She looked away and looked at the city moving past the window, and thought that she was probably the most efficient and least wise person she knew. She thought about the early days, the first weeks when she had looked at him and thought, a man doing an ordinary job. Nothing to examine here. She thought about how thoroughly that judgment had been wrong, not just partially wrong, not wrong in a forgivable way, but wrong in the specific way that comes from looking at someone and seeing only what you expect to see, because expectation is faster than observation, and you have trained yourself to move quickly. She had built her success on speed and pattern recognition, on being the person in the room who arrived at the conclusion before anyone else. And here was what that had cost her, in small and large ways both: the systematic undervaluation of the information that didn't fit the pattern, the person who didn't look the part, the resume that didn't follow the expected sequence, the driver who was reading financial prospectuses while he waited. She was not someone who went in for easy lessons. She had always been suspicious of the kind of story that resolves cleanly into a principle you can write on a wall. The business world ran on clean principles: shareholder value, competitive differentiation, quarterly growth, and she had learned early that the clean principles were the ones that made sense at altitude and fell apart at ground level, where the actual humans were, with their actual histories and their actual reasons for doing things that did not map onto the principle's logic. She had spent years building a company by being, she told herself, a realist, by being someone who saw things as they were and not as the narrative demanded they be. And yet what had she done with Ethan? From the first morning to the morning of the Meridian meeting, she had seen what the category told her to see: driver, service worker, ordinary man in ordinary circumstances. She had sorted him into the bin before she had looked at him, and then she had spent 6 weeks being slowly, quietly shown that the bin was wrong, and the showing had been so gradual and so unhurried that she had not even recognized it as a correction until it was complete. But this one had earned its truth, she thought. It had not been handed to her. She had been sitting 3 feet from it for 6 weeks before she saw it, which meant it was honest enough. The people who are most worth knowing, in her experience, are often the ones who have stopped performing for your benefit. They're not building toward your recognition. They're not angling for the acknowledgement that would tell them they've arrived somewhere. They already know where they are. They have arranged their lives around something more durable than the regard of people who don't know them, and they move through the world with the ease of someone who has nothing to prove because the proving is finished. Ethan had not walked into that conference room performing anything. He had walked in as himself, and himself had been more than enough. And the reason it had been more than enough was precisely that he had not needed it to be. That was the thing she kept returning to, not the expertise, not the history, not the $240 million valuation of a company he had built from an idea in a rented office somewhere and then walked away from without drama. The thing she kept returning to was the freedom of it. The specific freedom of a person who has decided, clearly and permanently, what actually matters to them, and has organized their entire life around that decision, and is therefore no longer subject to the 1,000 small anxieties that come from not having made it. She opened her laptop on the seat beside her, as she did every morning, and pulled up the day's calendar. 7 meetings. 3 calls. A board preparation session in the afternoon. She read through the agenda with the same focus she always brought to it. And then she looked up and watched the city for a moment. The buildings and the bridges and the cold river between them, all of it moving past at the speed of an ordinary morning. And she thought, pay attention. Not to the meetings, not to the outcomes, not to the numbers that would define the quarter. Pay attention to the people in the rooms, not who they are on paper, not what they're presenting, not the surface of the performance. Look for the thing underneath it, the thing that doesn't fit, the thing you weren't expecting to find. Because the thing you weren't expecting to find is, very often, if you're lucky enough to be paying attention, the thing that matters most. Not what someone once built, not the size of what they once had, but the integrity of what they chose to keep when everything else was gone. The decision they made when no one was measuring, when there was no strategic advantage to being decent or present or quietly correct. That decision is the only one that tells you who a person actually is. Everything else is resume. The car moved through the city. Ethan drove. The day had not yet decided what it would be. She let that be enough.